Hello friends, a very warm welcome to Scholar. This is Akshaya and I take your medieval history course here. This is the lesson number 10th of the series and we are going to talk about the second part of the discussion which we started in the last lesson, which is essentially about the socio-cultural account of the Rajputs dynasty, which we started in the last lesson, and we will also talk about the other major kingdoms which were ruling the country except the Rajputs after the fall of the tripartite powers. So essentially we are taking forward the discussion that we started in the last class, which is your age of conflict. With that said, let's get started. In the last lesson, just a quick recap before we begin. In the last lesson, we had started with the age of conflict and I had discussed why is it called as the age of conflict, and I introduced the concept of the age of conflict, and the period that we said we are going to be talking about is 1000 to 1200 AD essentially. Then I discussed that there were many smaller kingdoms which were coming over all over the country, especially North India, and in the South India you essentially had the imperial Cholas of Tanjore, but from 850 to 1200 almost. But in the north and Deccan there was a lot going on, and these were the different kingdoms which were coming up. And we started off with the discussion on the Rajput kingdoms, and we typically confine the discussion to their political history. The kingdoms that or the dynasties that we talked of were the Chauhans, the Chandelas, the Paramaras, the Chalukyas or the Solankis of Gujarat, the Tomars and the Gahadawalas of Kannauj. So this is what we talked of in the last class, and today let's start with the second part of the discussion, which is essentially a socio and a cultural account of the developments that took place during the Rajputs dynasty, starting off with the general conditions of the people. So when I began on the discussion, I said that this was breaking off the tripartite powers, which were the three powers which were ruling. Yes, please try to recall. There were Pratiharas, then there was Palas, and then there was Rashtrakutas, right? So these were the three powers which were essentially ruling. Some problem with the pen today, sorry about that. So these were the three Pratiharas, Palas and the Rashtrakutas were the three major dynasties which were ruling, and before the age of conflict, and during this time period they had started breaking up, and there were small feudatories which were coming up in the power. So this is essentially the feudalism when we talk of in the Indian history context. This is the feudalism that we are essentially referring to. So this was the dominating feature of the society of those times during the times of the Rajputs dynasty. Secondly, there was a great disparity between the standard of the living of the people. So you had two very there was a stark difference, and you had two very different categories of people, wherein on the one hand you had the ministers, officials, feudal chiefs, etc., who had the opportunity of having all the wealth and luxury and splendor of the world, and they would wear a lot of costly clothes, jewelries, etc., and they had these huge Rajputana palaces, etc., and complete grandeur, etc. This is how the lives of the feudal chiefs, ministers, officials, kings and nobles, etc. was. And how was it for the ordinary people? For the ordinary people, it was a very simple life. It was the basic staple that they could hardly manage all a day, and they were generally peasants, the cultivator class, and there was a lot of burden of the revenue and taxes that was also at the whims and fancies of the feudal lord. So this was about the general class division that was there in the society, and feudalism was an important dominating feature of the society, and great disparity in the standard of living of the people. Next important feature of the times was the caste system. Now in the caste system, if you see the lower castes, or the untouchables, they particularly, the disabilities or the discrimination that they were suffering had rather increased during the times of the Rajputs. So it worsened, the conditions deteriorated further, and the caste system rather took a rather worsened form during the times of Rajputs. The workers from the lowest stratum, which is the weavers, fishermen, barbers, and the workers, etc., they were, in addition to the tribals, they were all treated in a very harsh or a very bad manner. And there was a new caste which emerged, which we discussed in the last class, Rajput. Sometimes they said that they were the Kshatriyas of the Brahmanical system, and they essentially took up this new caste called as the Rajputs, and they had appeared on the political scene of the country. And in some time, I mean, in the longer run, due course of time, all the ruling families, no matter which caste they were from, sometimes they were even Brahmins, they were all classified as the Rajputs, essentially the children of the kings, or the Rajputras, or the Rajputs. So they all were begun to be called as the Rajputs. Now, how was the condition of the women in the Rajput society? So in the previous discussion I spoke of that generally the Rajputs would fight and get into a battle for the honor and honor, family, land, etc. And women in generally their honor was very dear to the Rajputs, but unfortunately the condition of the women was not as good, and there were several handicaps that the conditions of the women continued to suffer, or rather there was a deterioration, you could say, to an extent. So they were not given the right to study the Vedas, and they continued to be excluded from that thing. However, in certain higher families they could receive some higher education, but there was generally no political participation on their part. So even if they were educated, they would just be married to a different family and be their queen consort, that's all. But there was not really a strong political participation that you see from the women, and rather there was a glorification of certain wrong ideals and things like immolation, self-immolation along with dead husband, etc. Those were the kind of ideals followed, and this whole false glorified ideals, it further generated, and this whole practice of sati emerged, wherein a widow was burnt alive. She was burnt with the funeral pyre of the husband. So this is this is, you can say, it's another classic case of the deterioration that these higher false ideals led to during the times of Rajput. Johar was a kind of a ceremony wherein en masse, or in large group, the women would immolate themselves, and they would prevent being taken prisoners, etc., by an invading enemy, etc. So this was another you could say indicator of the deteriorating condition. And I'm sure in that story of the Rani Padmavati of Chittor, wherein this whole mass Johar occurred because the forces of Khilji were invading, and this is one of one of the very famous glorified Johars of the Rajput history. So this was another happening which was quite common of that time, and but there was no parda system. We'll study later. Parda came later when the Muslim invasions they started occurring, and the kind of culture they brought with themselves. So there was no parda system during the Rajputs, and the Swayamvar type of marriages, wherein the woman or the girl was permitted to choose the man she wanted to marry. Those kind of marriages were in vogue, and also the early marriages and infanticides, they had started to be practiced, because there was this whole dowry system, and the poorer people, they could not afford that kind of dowry, so they would prefer killing a girl child, thus the infanticide and these early marriages of girls. These things were in practice. Now let's talk about the kind of art and the art and culture that was developing during the times of the Rajput. So the first thing was the Nagara style of temple building. It reached its climax under the Rajput rules. So we had discussed earlier the three kinds of the temple building, three styles of the temple building, wherein Nagara was essentially the North Indian style, and then we had also discussed Vesara and Dravida, wherein Vesara was, it was a mix of the Nagara and the Dravida, which was during essentially the Western Chalukyas and later Hoysalas, etc. And Dravida was essentially the South Indian style, typically reaching its climax during the Cholas. So the first style, or the Nagara or the North Indian style of temple building, reached its climax during the Rajputs rule. And there were other, prominent buildings, for instance, canals, dams, forts, palaces, temples, etc., which were built by the Rajputs. And they have built some really famous palaces, for instance the palaces of the Jaipur and Udaipur, and the forts of the Chittor, Mandu, Jodhpur and Gwalior. Gwalior fort, they say, was so magnificent that even the Emperor Babur, when he was when he had come to invade India, and when he reached Gwalior and he saw this fort of Gwalior, he was astounded by the magnificence and the grandeur of the Gwalior fort. So these were the kind of the fine specimens of the grandeur, and this is the kind of the architecture which was prevalent during the or done by the Rajputs. Some famous other examples of those times are the Lingaraj temple at Bhubaneswar and the Konark Sun temple. These one built by the Rajputs because there was a different dynasty in the Odisha, which we'll just discuss, but these are also the contemporary constructions of the Rajputs times. And Khajuraho we have discussed. Chandelas, Chandelas were there of Bundelkhand, they were ruling, and they have built the famous temples in Khajuraho, for instance the Kandariya Mahadev, and the famous one of the Dilwara temples is also built by a Rajput minister. And some very famous historical works, for instance the Kalhanas. This is a history of Kashmir, and he was essentially in the times of in the court of a Kashmiri ruler, but again a contemporary of this dynasty. So the Kalhanas Rajtarangani was also written during this time. And Chanbardai's Prithviraj Raso was actually, Chanbardai was a court poet at the court of the Prithviraj Chauhan. Another work was Prithviraj Jaya, which was written by Jayanka. He was also a court poet at the court of Prithviraj Chauhan. So these are some important contributions during the times or by the Rajput dynasty to art and culture. Next, we will see in the next lesson that during the Islamic conquest, finally Rajputs were defeated, and the Islamic invaders were able to win over so many Rajputs kingdoms, and ultimately it was a defeat that they had to face. But the question arises that despite of being so many mighty powers of the Rajputs, why were the Rajputs defeated? So this is essentially the slide which answers that question, and we'll look at the key reasons, starting with the most important one, which is the lack of unity. So the Rajputs, there were so many kingdoms, for instance Paramaras, Chauhans and Chandelas, Gahdavalas, etc., that they were never united, and they were constantly fighting against each other. In fact, the only battle in which they came together, which was the Battle of Tarain 1, I think, wherein they did sense the kind of danger that they had from Muhammad Gauri, and they came together. They were able to defeat Gauri, who was himself a very strong. So this was the first most important reason, that there was a lack of unity amongst the Rajputs, and they would rather fight amongst themselves. For instance, Chauhans wanted to invade Delhi, and Tomars wanted to invade Bundelkhand, etc. They just go on. There was constant infighting amongst themselves. Also, the next reason was that their military methods were very out of date, or they were very old school compared to the new fast cavalry that the Muslim invaders were bringing amongst, along with themselves. Rajputs were rather relying on the slow elephants, and the Muslims took to the fast cavalry. So this was the next point. And then there was better organization and more able leadership with the Muslim kings. Also, there was a religious zeal. In the next lesson I'll explain the whole idea of a Ghazi fighter, wherein they are fighting to spread Islam, and they have this they're really zealous and they wanted to spread the religion. This was another reason for the kind of fervor or intensity that the Muslims were fighting with. And they were also highly attracted by the greed for the wealth, the famous wealth, of the land of India. And also, whenever it came to the Hindu kingdoms, they never took a strategic, offensive strategy. They would always took a defensive position, which was a weaker strategy compared to what the invaders were doing. They were essentially trying to expand their kingdom, and the Rajputs or the Hindu kingdoms were always trying to defend themselves or save themselves. So this was a rather weaker stance. And lastly, this duty of fighting was only confined to one class, which was the Kshatriyas. This was another reason for the defeat of Rajputs. So the lack of unity, fighting amongst themselves, outdated military methods, better organization and leadership of the Muslims, the religious zeal with which they were fighting to spread Islam, and the greed for wealth, the defensive position of the Rajputs, which was a weaker stance, and finally the one class, that is the Kshatriyas, only were confined to fighting. Right? And these were the major reasons for the defeat of Rajputs, most important being the lack of unity and constant in fighting amongst different classes amongst the Rajputs. Different kingdoms amongst the Rajputs. Now this brings us to the end of the discussion on Rajputs, wherein we have covered different clans on the Rajputs, and then we have taken account of the socio-political account of the Rajputs dynasty, and we've also discussed why were they defeated at the hands of the Muslim invaders. Now let's look at the other major kingdoms which were in power across the country during this period of 1000 to 1200 AD, which we are calling as the age of conflict. Right? So in addition to Rajputs, which were the other powers which were ruling the country. Yes, so this is how this map I think I've shown you even earlier. These were the different dynasties. We're going to talk about the Hindu Shahis, Kashmir. There were different dynasties ruling between this time. Then this is Rajputs that we have discussed already. Then Palas, they were taken over by the Senas later, right? So this is essentially how India looked at the start of this period, and towards the end of this discussion, we'll look at the different dynasties which were there during this time period of 1000 to 1200 AD. Also remember that Ghaznavids had almost reached the frontiers of India by the time this period had started. So there was a lot going on in the West Asia and Middle East as well, which is the topic of discussion for the next lesson. Yeah, right. So let's start with the first area and the major kingdoms, which is the Kashmir and the Northwest. So in this region, essentially in Kashmir, there was a Karkota dynasty which ruled from 7th to 9th century, and some important facts that you can remember I've written here. These are the only facts that you could be expected to remember from these topics. So the names of the major kingdoms. First is your Kashmir. Remember the king Lalitaditya, who had built the famous Martanda temple, which is a sun temple. The first sun temple in India is your Martanda temple in Kashmir. It was built by the king Lalitaditya of the Karkota dynasty. Then came the Utpalas, who ruled from 8th to 10th, and then there was the last dynasty in this period was the Lohara dynasty, and the famous ruler from this dynasty was Queen Diddi. Yeah, so these were the three dynasties which ruled over Kashmir. And then in the northwest, there was a you can see in this map, there was this Hindu Shahi kingdom. Essentially they were ruling, and they ruled from 9th to almost 12th century, and the most important contribution is their fight against Ghazni. You remember in this discussion I had spoken at one point the king Anand Pala, who was supported by the king Boja from the Paramaras during his fight against Ghazni, right? So this is that same dynasty from which Anandpala belong. Next is the Kalachuris of Tripuri. So this was another dynasty which was essentially ruling in the central India region of around Jabalpur, between Narmada and Godavari rivers, and this was ruling between the 9th to 12th century. Constantly at fight, they had these famous fight with the Gahadavalas because they were ruling in a nearby area. This was another important player. And then there was Senas at Bengal. So essentially, after the Palas of the tripartite powers, after the Palas declined, who came up? Senas came up in Bengal, and they came up under this strong king called as Vijay Sena. Vijay Sena is also famous for the famous Vaishnava poet Jayadeva, who had written Geet Govinda. Extremely important Jayadeva, who had written Geet Govinda. He was at the court of Vijay Sena, who was a Sena ruler from Bengal. Odisha, there were Gangas, the eastern Gangas as they were called sometimes, because there was a different kingdom called as the western Gangas. You remember we had done western Gangas. Western Gangas were from Mysore. This we had done in your 600 to 750 wala jo phase we had covered. Western Gangas of Mysore we had done under that. And so to distinguish these Gangas from those Gangas, we call them as the eastern Gangas of Odisha, right? So these were the eastern Gangas, and they were ruling from around 11th to 15th century at Kalinga or Odisha. Their famous contributions: the Sun Temple at Konark and the famous Jagannath Temple of Puri. These were built by Sun Temple and your Jagannath Puri Temple. They were built by the eastern Gangas of Odisha. And then lastly, you have this dynasty, which is the Western Chalukyas of Kalyani, or they are also called as the later Western Chalukyas. I think we've had this discussion on the 3 branches of Chalukyas, wherein we discussed this dynasty in great detail. But just a quick sum up I'll give you again. This was between the 10th to 12th centuries, and they were the feudatories of Rashtrakutas. Essentially, there was this person called as Telapa or Tela II, who defeated the Rashtrakutas, who were his overlords, and he made Manyaketa. Manyaketa was actually the capital of Rashtrakutas, right? So he made that city his capital, and he established this Western Chalukyas or the later Western Chalukyas. Why are they called as the later Western Chalukyas? Because they were essentially the descendants of the Badami Chalukyas, right? So this is this dynasty, and they had this really famous king Vikramaditya VI, who had these 2 poets, Bilhana and Vijaneshwara. Really important from the culture perspective. Please remember these names. Vikramanka Deva Charitra, it's a work on whose life? On the life of Vikramaditya VI, and he was a Western Chalukyan king. And these Chalukyas had constructed some really famous temples: Mallikarjuna Temple, Mahadeva Temple at Itagi. This temple is sometimes called as the Emperor of Temples. You can remember, Emperor of Temples, Mahadeva Temple at Itagi. And then Katabeshwara Temple and Kalleshwara Temple. So these some famous temples. All of these are in Karnataka, and they were all constructed during the reign of Western Chalukyas. So yes, that's it. And I'll just now show you in the map of India that which were the major powers that were in power from 1000 to 1200 AD, this period. So in Kashmir, you had the Karkotas, followed by Utpals and Lohar dynasty. Then you had the Hindu Shahis, who were ruling essentially in this region, which is there is Pakistan, and then there is Afghanistan. So they were ruling here in the northwest Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan. And then there were Arabs here, two branches in Pakistan, who were essentially in and around the Sindh region. And then there were very many Rajput dynasties. For instance, there was Chauhans in the Malwa, Tomars in your Haryana, Delhi region, Chandelas, who was essentially there in Bundelkhand, this region, Gadavlas near Kannauj and almost till Bihar. Then there was Senas in Bengal, Eastern Gangas in Odisha. Of course, there were Cholas in your south region, Imperial Cholas, not just South, they were even until Southeast Asia. That's a different discussion. And then the Chalukyas, which were in this region, and then the Solankis in Gujarat, right? So this is the location of the various did I say Paramaras? Sorry, yes, the Paramaras also of the Malwa, and the Chauhans of the Ajmer we've discussed already. So these, you know, were the major kingdoms or the major powers, and just to give you a sense of the different locations where they were located in India, so that when we take the story forward and we discuss the Islamic conquest of the northern India in the next lesson, you have a sense of the different kingdoms which were the major stakeholders in the India of that time, and it will be easier for you to understand and pick the story from here, right? So what did we learn today? We learned about the various social and cultural development during Rajput, wherein we discussed the art and architecture, the conditions of people, particularly women, the caste system which came up, and then this was about the social cultural development. And then we also talked about, after that we also talked about the other major kingdoms you know, which were in power during 1000 to 1200 AD. And this learning will essentially help us understand what we are going to cover in the next lesson, which is the Islamic conquest of India, which is essentially the same period, which is 1000 to 1200 AD, right? So we have covered so much so far, and this is the agenda for the next lesson. So yeah, that brings us to the end of the discussion today. Thank you so much for watching, and for more such videos for your UPSC preparation, please log on to scholar.com. Thank you so much once again.